So as you look at the overall distribution net position, again, unrestricted at the close of the 17 fiscal year was 814,376 in capital assets, and then the 44,000 in the restricted for debt service line item. Agency revenues, again, this is the Alturas revenue, so near the closure of the district, annual revenues in the Alturas district were approximately $400,000 per year. And with the closure of that district, that went to zero, and that district no longer receives any revenues. Within Legacy, we had some change. So obviously from the formation in 2008, then you had the first year of '09 where we had little to no increment. That increment then grew up here in 2012, and then it was identified that there was an error in the accounting of the increment valuation with the states and the counties' accounting software. That resulted in a reduction of the increment valuation, and then since 2013 we have seen this growth. 15, 16, 17 were fairly flat, so we had little activity happening, but beginning in 2018 that increment value is growing, and that's the budgeted value based upon the preliminary valuation. So we saw a $3 million increase in valuation from 16 into the 17 tax year, and then we expect to see a much larger increase as we move into the 18 tax year. That will infect the valuation increment growth going up in the FY 2019 fiscal year. Yes.
So you know when we changed Legacy Crossing to come out, does that, you know, we're talking about moving?
So we're talking about expanding the district to include Main Street.
Will that help?
It won't change the increment, but the base valuation will change slightly, but it will not reset the base.
Oh, okay.
So we will not lose increment valuation. In 2016, the legislature did make an amendment that stated that any plans adopted after that date where the plan was modified or amended would result in a reset of the base valuation, but it did provide an exclusion for any existing plans that existed prior to the 2016 calendar year.
Okay.
So it will not affect them.
Good.
With regard to the properties in Alturas that are still owned by the URA, what's the property tax situation on that?
They're not taxed because we are an exempt entity. So there's no tax increment or no taxes being paid on those properties. When the agency moved into phase 2, there were some land use restrictions the agency placed upon the property that were above and beyond the zoning restrictions that exist within the RTO zoning district. Those were prohibited from being amended for 12 years, and that time period is coming up here this upcoming spring. So beginning in 2019, we can reevaluate whether the agency wishes to retain those restrictions upon the property. So currently it is very tightly restricted to just really technology-based businesses, and that is really the only entity that can develop in any of the lots that the agency currently holds. That has been in place for quite some time, and we've had very little interest in the properties. The district, has been closed, the project has been closed, and so I think the agency will be working with other business and property owners within Alturas to reevaluate that coming up this spring. If that occurs, we expect to see more interest in those lots, but based upon the current restrictions, it really has dampened interest in development and purchase of those lots. Our agency expenses, again, you see that same peak here in the 2016 fiscal year for the Alturas fund, so that is largely of the $900,000. $849,000 was the disbursement of excess tax revenues that the agency had accumulated over the last couple of years of that district, and so those were refunded back to the county to be dispersed back to the taxing districts. And so we received no new revenues on the Alturas district, obviously with it being closed. Revenues for Legacy Crossing, or I should say expenses for Legacy Crossing, had been fairly flat up until 2015, then we began the remediation work. And so that's been really the bulk of the expenses that the agency has incurred over the last several years has been related to the environmental remediation on that property. Those have been reimbursed through an EPA cleanup grant. So we received approximately 90% reimbursement for those expenses on that project. And we've seen some investment again into that property. Overall general agency, which covers the general operations of the agency, previously the city and the agency shared the executive director position. It was a half-time executive director with the agency, and it was a half-time economic development specialist with the city of Moscow. Jeff Jones was the last individual to hold that position. Jeff left in the 2015 time period, and so we did see a reduction as the executive director services were wrapped into the city services agreement. So for a long period of time, the city has provided a number of services to the agency, financial accounting, as well as general administrative, limited legal services, engineering and planning services from the community development engineering departments. And the agency has reimbursed the city an amount approximately $30,000 per year for those services. Beginning in 16, we also included the executive director services, and that agreement was the fees associated with that agreement were increased from $30,000 to $45,000 to include those additional services, and that has resulted in a reduction of general agency operational expenses for the agency since that time. As we look at the Alturas Fund, again, we had fund balance that had been built up here before the closure of the district, and those funds were then expended out. And the fund balances then were zeroed out. So with the closure of the district, Alturas no longer receives any revenues. The legacy fund itself has built up some fund balance, but we've seen these expenses over the last 3 years related to the environmental remediation, the frontage improvements, as well as other participation in private development throughout the district. So we have seen those expenses increase. 18 is based on our anticipated budgeted numbers, and we do have some fairly large expenses we'd identified related to the 6 and Jackson property. We have some debt that we'll have to pay off on that property. We have the Hello Walk construction and some other projects. So we are expecting to see some somewhat high investment expenses in the 18 fiscal year, and that was dropping our fund balances down. But we are seeing these revenues increase, and we expect to see those substantially increase here over the next 2 years as well. Fund balances, Alturas with the closure was zeroed out and refunded back to the taxing districts. Fund balance in legacy has been growing, but we do expect to see those expenditures here over the coming year. That'll drop our fund balance down a little bit, and general fund has just been holding steady, covering our fund balances required for the operational expenses of the agency. Yes.
I think we need to retain a small amount, maybe it's in the general, for if there were some expenses associated with Alturas, like landscaping or something like that, right?
With Alturas, we did set aside $45,000 at the closure of the district for, it was anticipated to be $9,000 per year for 5 years we have some maintenance obligations on those 6 lots we hold. We have some advertising and marketing expenses that we incur with those lots. So we did take funds from the Alturas and put it into a restricted general fund line item to help pay for those expenses as they occur. And so those are part of the general fund balances.
And on the slide that showed the Alturas expenses, we just haven't had to use any of that in 2017?
They're not coming out of the Alturas fund any longer. They're coming out of the general fund.
Thank you.
And so I think we had just under 4,000 expenses last year. We do have an agreement with the city to have the Parks Rec Department do weed control and mowing on the lots, and we pay for that expense. That's probably our largest expense for Alturas that we've had recently. But those are now coming out of a new line item that was created in the 17 fiscal year for Alturas maintenance, because with the closure of the district, the auditors wanted to have those funds moved out of the Alturas fund, and it was placed in a restricted line item within the general fund. So that's why you do see a little bit of a bump here in 16 in the general fund balance, and then we've been expending a little bit of that out over the last couple of years. Long-term debt trend for the agency in the 15 fiscal year, the debt associated with the Alturas district was paid off, and the only remaining debt that we've had has been the bonds for the 6 and Jackson property, as well as, I think included in here is the repayment agreement with Latah County for that error in assessment. The agency did receive some revenues for a couple of years that we should not have received, and we were repaying those funds back to the county over time. And so both bonds and that long-term county repayment are included in that number there, but we do see that number declining. So with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have. And after that, request that the council accept this annual report.
Questions for Bill?
I have a question about the identity property. Somebody had asked me about their parking, and so I went in and talked to them. And I was wondering how the Urban Renewal Agency helped them figure out parking with the university. That's what they told me. They talked to the university.
The agency was not a party to that. The agency just worked with identity on the environmental remediation and highway access improvements.
Okay.
So the agency itself is not related to the project or to any land use approvals they may have received. The agency just worked with them on the remediation of the Sharp property that was a prior petroleum distribution site.
Right.
And then as well as any highway access improvements needed to gain access there. Identity initially only owned the property to the north of the Sharp site and was going to gain access across the Paradise Path in the driveway that exists in that right turn lane. And we did work with them to encourage the acquisition of the adjacent vacant Sharp property, do the environmental remediation, get the access to the signalized intersection to avoid that pathway conflict. But that was the extent of the agency's participation on the project.
And anything else that they do is just them, working with the university.
If they have any relationship with the university, that's between
Theirs.
them and the university. They did come through with a planned unit development approval through the Planning and Zoning Commission with a parking reduction mitigation plan. And so they did receive a reduction in the off-street parking required for the project because of its location, bike parking placement, 2 zip cars are required to be on site. So they did mitigation for on-site parking. I don't know what relationship they may have developed with the university.
Okay, thank you for your help.
Other questions for Bill?
I just have a statement. Bill, this URA is an example of how it works and how it works really well. And I think you ought to give a seminar to the rest of the state on how to do this, because you have the answers and it's there, and the detail is just very, very impressive. And hurry up and get the Southeast Moscow Industrial Park going.
That's next.
Patience is not one of my virtues. Sorry.
Okay, I move to accept the MURA 2017 annual report.
Second.
Ann?
Sure.
Okay, we got a motion by Catherine and a second by Ann to accept the Mura 2017 annual report. We'll start with you, Ann.
Aye.
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 Okay, very good. Thank you, Bill, very much for a wonderful report.